Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to examine a recent defence of non-naturalist moral realism proposed by Terence Cuneo and Russ Shafer-Landau in their article The Moral Fixed Points. They propose a new way of understanding moral non-naturalism that, at least they argue, allows moral non-naturalists to respond to some of the central objections to their view. So the basic idea is that there is a set of moral propositions that have the status of conceptual truths. They are true just in virtue of the concepts that the propositions contain, similar to all bachelors are unmarried or vixens are female foxes. These propositions are what they call the moral fixed points. But first let's begin by characterising moral non-naturalism. I do have a whole series on metaethics, including an introductory video on non-naturalism, so I'm going to be fairly brief here. If you want more detail, you can check out those other videos, which I will link in the comments. But the basic claim of moral non-naturalism is that there are non-natural moral truths. So moral non-naturalism is a form of moral realism, and as such, non-naturalism claims that some moral propositions are true, and these truths are discovered, not invented. So it is true that slavery is wrong, and even if everybody believed that slavery was acceptable, slavery would still be wrong. It's analogous to a claim like protons contain 2 up quarks, or Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth. It is a fact that protons contain 2 up quarks, and this is independent of anybody's beliefs or attitudes. Similarly for Mount Everest being the tallest mountain on Earth, it's something we discover. It's not dependent on what we think or feel. So that's moral realism in general. There are moral truths that we discover that we can be correct or incorrect about. Non-naturalists add that the true moral propositions are not made true merely by natural facts. So this requires a distinction between natural and non-natural facts, and things get a bit tricky here because there are various ways in which this distinction can be understood. We might frame it in terms of methodology, so we might say that inquiry in ethics is fundamentally different to inquiry in the natural sciences. Natural facts are those that are discovered through the use of empirical methods, perceptual observation, empirical experiment, and so on. Ethics is not an empirical science and cannot become an empirical science. The tools that we need for discovering the moral truths are fundamentally different from the tools used by science. That's one way to think about it. Another way is to understand the distinction in terms of metaphysics. So we might say that moral properties are fundamentally different from natural properties and not reducible to natural properties, where natural properties are those that exist in space and time and have causal powers and so on. Moral properties are going to be something over and above these natural properties. Again, you know, like this distinction is, well, understood in different ways. Again, if you want more detail on this, look at the videos in my previous videos in the Metaethics series. So that's moral non-naturalism broadly speaking. Now, in the last couple of decades, this view has become more popular, but it has always faced some major challenges. In particular, there are concerns about the metaphysics of non-naturalism. So non-naturalism seems to be committed to a kind of inflationary ontology. It postulates these moral facts or moral properties beyond what is part of the natural world, beyond what can be discovered by the sciences. These sort of non-natural moral facts do not seem to play any sort of explanatory or causal role in our picture of the world. As J. L. Mackie famously put it, if there were objective values, then they would be entities or qualities or relations of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. How could there be non-natural properties? I mean, it's a notion that seems very difficult to square with our modern scientific worldview. Certainly, it arguably seems to violate, you know, Occam's razor, right? Like there is a basic principle of simplicity. Do not multiply entities beyond necessity. Do not postulate things that are not required in order to explain and understand the world, and that we just don't seem to need to postulate moral properties in order to explain any of the phenomena that we are confronted with. Then there is a corresponding epistemological problem, because if moral facts are non-natural facts, then how could we know about them? Human beings are presumably biological organisms, and as such, we are part of the natural world, and that makes it rather puzzling how we could have access to a realm of non-natural facts. Again, Mackey states the problem clearly. He says, and I quote, none of our ordinary accounts of sensory perception or introspection or the framing and confirming of explanatory hypotheses or inference or logical construction or conceptual analysis or any combination of these will provide a satisfactory answer. So the thought is that, if we're postulating these non-natural moral facts, we're going to be forced to say that, how we know about them is just through this kind of special faculty of moral intuition. That's it, right? And it's not clear how this faculty would work, how it could be connected to the moral facts. So there's an epistemic challenge here. Now, of course, I'm being very brief here. Non-naturalists do have answers to these challenges, but these remain significant concerns about the view. Non-naturalism, both the metaphysics and the epistemology, has led to objections. So, with this in mind, we can state Cuneo and Shafer-Landau's view. Their basic claim is that there are various moral propositions that are non-naturalistic conceptual truths, and they label these propositions the moral fixed points. So here are some examples of these propositions. It is wrong to torture somebody just because they have inconvenienced you. It is wrong to recreationally slaughter a fellow person. It is wrong to impose severe burdens on others merely because of their physical appearance. The interests of others are sometimes morally weightier than our own. There is some moral reason to offer aid to those in distress, if such aid is easily given and comes at little expense. It is morally admirable to express gratitude to a benefactor whose gift resulted from substantial sacrifice undertaken from exclusively altruistic motives, etc., etc. Now, note that all of these hold only pro tanto, so perhaps we could describe unusual situations in which there are other factors that outweigh these reasons, but in anything like normal circumstances, it's going to be, for instance, wrong to recreationally slaughter a fellow person. So it is pro tanto wrong to recreationally slaughter a fellow person, right? This is suggested as an example of a conceptual truth. So the thought is that the moral fixed points are moral propositions that are true partly in virtue of the moral concepts that constitute them. And so there are two important things to note here. So first thing is that we're claiming that the moral fixed points are conceptual truths. So we don't need to do any investigation of the world in order to discover that they are true. If you compare this to a statement such as unmarried men are bachelors, well, that is made true by its concept, by the concept unmarried men and the concept bachelor, because of what those concepts are. The statement unmarried men are bachelors is true, and there's no possible circumstance in which it could be false. It's not like we could do some empirical investigation and discover unmarried men who are not bachelors. Obviously we can't do that. We go out and perform some sort of experiment on human beings, and we're like, oh, it turns out this unmarried man actually is a bachelor. This unmarried man actually is not a bachelor, right? Obviously that's not going to happen. And of course the second point here is that Cuneo and Shafer-Landau take it that these propositions are made true not just by moral concepts, but by non-natural moral concepts. And this is just to say that moral concepts cannot be reduced to natural concepts. So the concept wrong, for instance, cannot be defined purely in terms of concepts that pick out natural properties, such as the concept pain or the concept frustrated desires. Go and see the previous videos on moral naturalism and moral non-naturalism for more on this. But, the basic idea is that any analysis, when we say something like X is wrong, right, we can't just define that in terms of X maximizes pain or X produces like lots of frustrated desires or anything along those lines. Wrong is not going to be reducible to concepts that just pick out natural properties. One thing that is worth noting at this point is that this does not necessarily require a commitment to the view that there are any non-natural properties or facts. It's a claim about concepts. Cuneo and Shafer-Landau suggest there could still be non-natural truths because the propositions are made true by concepts that are not reducible to natural concepts, but it's not obvious that that entails that there are non-natural properties. We'll explore this point in a bit more detail later, but just flagging that up here. Okay, so Cuneo and Shafer-Landau then claim that, I quote, something counts as a moral system only if it incorporates a sufficiently wide range of fixed points. The moral fixed points delineate the boundaries of moral thought. A person who does not accept the moral fixed points couldn't really engage in moral thought at all. They wouldn't have moral concepts. More precisely, the moral fixed points are part of what Cuneo and Shafer-Landau call any minimally eccentric moral system. A minimally eccentric moral system is a set of propositions that is consistent, that is comprehensive in the sense that it provides moral verdicts about nearly all situations that an agent might face. So it provides comprehensive guidelines for behaviour. The system applies to beings like us who exist in a world like ours, so beings that are mortal, that are biological, that have a sense of personal identity over time, that are rational, that have emotional capacities, and who live in a world regulated by laws of nature at least somewhat similar to those that obtain in our world. Any such system must include the moral fixed point. So any moral system like this must include the moral fixed point. And in this sense, the fixed points constitute the boundaries of morality. They distinguish moral systems from other normative systems. So if you think about, for instance, aesthetic norms or norms of prudence or norms concerning etiquette, it may violate etiquette to, eat with your elbows on the table, but we wouldn't take that to be morally wrong, although maybe it would be morally wrong to be rude to somebody by doing that. As aesthetic norms, okay, so this is a piece of bad art, but just making bad art, we don't usually think of that as morally wrong, right? So there are lots of norms that we have that are not moral norms, and what makes something a moral norm is that it's part of a system that incorporates the moral fixed points. The moral fixed points are part of the boundaries of morality. If somebody rejects the moral fixed points, then they just don't have moral concepts. And when they use words like wrong, maybe they mean aesthetically wrong or wrong in terms of violating etiquette, but they can't be referring to moral wrongness. Moreover, the moral fixed points can play a foundational role in moral reasoning. The moral fixed points are not going to exhaust our moral knowledge. What happens is rather that we can start with the moral fixed points. So we can take the moral fixed points as the sort of starting point in our investigation, in our inquiry, and then we apply the standard inferential tools like conceptual analysis, inference to the best explanation, appeal to theoretical virtues like simplicity and explanatory power and so on, to infer further moral norms. This isn't to say that the moral fixed points are the fundamental moral principles. It may be that the moral fixed points are themselves derivable from some underlying general moral principles. So, for instance, perhaps utilitarianism is the correct moral theory, and we can learn that utilitarianism is correct by starting with the moral fixed points and then seeing that utilitarianism entails the moral fixed points or provides the best way to accommodate the moral fixed points. That might be one way of proceeding. The point is just that any acceptable moral theory had better include the norm that it is pro tanto wrong to recreationally slaughter fellow people, that it is pro tanto good to offer aid to those in distress. The moral fixed points are the starting point of inquiry in much the same way that certain basic perceptual observations are the starting point of scientific inquiry. So, just as any acceptable astronomical theory had better entail that from the perspective of the Earth, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, so any acceptable moral theory had better entail that it's pro tanto wrong to recreationally slaughter people, right? So like the claim, so we observe we just have this basic perceptual observation of the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, and that's just something that, you know, like any theory about how the solar system works, you know, any laws that are proposed as governing the behaviour of the planets and stars, they had better be compatible with the claim that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Along the same lines, like any acceptable moral theory had better entail that it's pro tanto wrong to recreationally slaughter people, because it's like that's a fixed point. That's one of the places where we start when we engage in moral reasoning. So, so the thought is that the moral fixed points are conceptual truths. Now, this raises two questions. First of all, what is a conceptual truth? And second, how can we determine whether a proposition is a conceptual truth? So let's begin with this question of what exactly is a conceptual truth. Cuneo and Shafer-Landau state their view as follows. They say that the proposition that X is F is a conceptual truth if it belongs to the essence of F, that necessarily anything that satisfies X also satisfies F. So take the proposition that unmarried men are bachelors. It is part of the essence of the concept bachelor that anything that satisfies the concept unmarried man also satisfies the concept bachelor. So anything to which the concept unmarried man applies is also a thing to which the concept bachelor applies. Right, that's the idea here, right? Fairly straightforward, actually. Fairly straightforward idea, I think. So if we then consider the moral proposition that recreational slaughter is wrong, well, to say that this is a conceptual truth is to say that it belongs to the essence of wrong, that anything that satisfies recreational slaughter, so any behaviour that is an example of recreational slaughter, also satisfies being wrong, or it satisfies wrong. So yeah, as Cuneo and Shafer-Landau see it, it's worth noting that for them, concepts are not simply ideas in our heads. Concepts are not simply words. Two people can share the same concept, and two words can express the same concept. So, like snow in English it expresses the same concept as Schnee in German. And obviously two different people can both be thinking about snow. They can both have the same concept of snow. So concepts are abstract, mind-independent devices that enable people to refer to things in the world. Like a concept is something that purports to pick out some object or property or event. And so with the concept unmarried man, that purports to pick out certain things, and those things that are picked out by that concept are the same as the things picked out by the concept bachelor, or at least like the concept bachelor is going to pick out the same things. Yeah. Okay, that's conceptual truth. The next question then is, why believe that the moral fixed points are conceptual truths? Well, Cuneo and Shafer-Landau suggest 4 features of propositions that are indicative of conceptual truth, and they try to show that all of these features are exhibited by the moral fixed points. So they don't try to give a conclusive argument for the claim that the moral fixed points are conceptual truths, but they think that that we have good reason to believe that they are, that there are various features that point in that direction. All right, well, a first feature of conceptual truths is that conceptual truths are necessary truths. So when P is a conceptual truth, then P is necessarily true. It's true in all possible circumstances. And this is because when P is a conceptual truth, it's true in virtue of the concepts that constitute P. But if it's true in virtue of the concepts that constitute it, then the nature of the world will be irrelevant to its truth. So like, unmarried men are bachelors, that's necessarily true because it will be true whatever way the world turns out to be. It's true in virtue of the relations between the concepts. Similarly with it is wrong to recreationally slaughter a fellow person, well, if that's true, it seems it would be necessarily true, at least where fellow person refers to the kind of beings that human beings are, where killing ends our existence. I mean, again, like maybe there are bizarre situations where it becomes acceptable to recreationally slaughter people. So like if an evil demon says that he will send us all to hell unless we engage in recreational slaughter, maybe that's okay. But, the sort of claim that it is pro tanto wrong to recreationally slaughter people. Could there be any situations where that would be false? Well, Cuneo and Shafer-Landau would say, surely not, right? Second, conceptual truths have framework status, which is to say that they fix the boundaries of the subject in question. So consider the proposition, God is a perfect being. This fixes the boundaries of the subject matter of theology. If you deny that God is a perfect being, then we would conclude that you are simply not using the same concept God as theologians are. You're not talking about what theologians are talking about when they talk about God. We've already seen that Cuneo and Shafer-Landau take it that the moral fixed points fix the boundaries of morality. They fix what counts as a moral system. So the moral fixed points have framework status. Third, to deny conceptual truths tends to be baffling or bewildering to those who are competent users of the concepts in question. Like there would be something baffling about somebody who just like says that no, God is not a perfect being. Like God actually kind of sucks. He's just rubbish at various things. Right? That would be an odd position to hold. Or consider somebody who denies that red is a colour. That red can be visually perceived. We would find it difficult to know how to respond to somebody who said such things. We would point out, look, you just seem to be confused about what the terms mean. And there's not much more of a response we could give. Similarly, Cuneo and Shafer-Landau think it would be baffling for somebody to deny that it is pro tanto wrong to recreationally slaughter a fellow person. Like if I claim that recreational slaughter is good, that's an immoral view, that's a repugnant view, but moreover, it's just kind of baffling. To say that recreational slaughter is good, you'd think that there must be something like mentally wrong with me, if I held that kind of attitude. Fourth, conceptual truths are knowable a priori. Knowledge of conceptual truths can be acquired independently of experience. This is because we know conceptual truths just by understanding the constituent concepts. So we need not engage in any empirical investigation. We didn't discover through empirical inquiry that it is pro tanto wrong to recreationally slaughter people. As long as you know what a person is and what recreational slaughter is, as long as you know those things, then you will be able to see that it's wrong to recreationally slaughter people. You don't need to perform experiments or anything to figure that out, or even perform any observation at all. Again, just knowing what these concepts refer to is enough to figure that out. So the moral fixed points bear all four of the marks of conceptual truths, and this gives us reason to think that the moral fixed points are indeed conceptual truths. Cuneo and Shafer-Landau then summarize their non-naturalism as follows. They say, there are non-natural moral truths. These truths include the moral fixed points, which are a species of conceptual truth, as they are propositions that are true in virtue of the essences of their constituent concepts. So that's the view, and hopefully you can see at least some of the motivation for why somebody might hold this view. But Cuneo and Shafer-Landau then go on to argue that this should be a particularly pleasing view for non-naturalists because it allows the non-naturalists to respond to some of the standard objections to non-naturalism. So let's take a look to see how we can kind of develop non-naturalism if we accept this view. So first, the moral fixed points help us to respond to the metaphysical objections to non-naturalism. We noted previously that a central objection to non-naturalism is that the very notion of non-natural properties is just kind of weird or spooky. It's hard to fit such properties into our modern scientific worldview. But now consider the idea that these moral truths are conceptual truths. Well, there's nothing at all weird about conceptual truths, or at least if conceptual truths are weird, then we can cite a variety of companions in guilt. So unmarried men are bachelors, that's a conceptual truth, it's true in virtue of the concepts, but that's not in any way anti-scientific. You know, if you're happy to grant that there are some conceptual truths like this, then you shouldn't have any metaphysical objection to the moral fixed points. Now, as one of the things I mentioned earlier was that if we take the moral fixed points to be conceptual truths, we don't necessarily have to postulate moral properties or moral facts in the world. So we usually think of truth in terms of correspondence to the facts, like correspondence between a proposition and the world. So take Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth. Well, I mean, I assume this proposition is true, and then the question is, what makes it true? And the standard answer would be something like this. The proposition Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth, this picks out a couple of objects. It picks out Mount Everest and Earth. It ascribes a property to Mount Everest, a relational property between Mount Everest and the other mountains on Earth. Now it happens to be the case that these objects really exist, and Mount Everest really does have this property. The object that is picked out by the term Mount Everest is indeed the tallest mountain on the object that is picked out by the term Earth. So this proposition is true because it corresponds to the way the world is. It corresponds to facts and properties in the world. And we might then think that for every truth, there must be facts in the world that correspond to that truth. In which case, if there are non-natural moral truths, there must be non-natural properties and facts. But conceptual truths do not require there to be any facts in the world that correspond to them. If a proposition is a conceptual truth, what makes it true are not any worldly facts, but simply the nature of the concepts that are involved in the proposition. So with unmarried men are bachelors, that would be true even if there were no unmarried men, even if there were no bachelors, right? Like a completely empty world, a world empty of all people, would be a world in which that proposition is still true. So this suggests that the non-naturalist doesn't actually need to postulate moral facts and properties. Now I should note that Cuneo and Shafer-Landau themselves do think that there are moral facts and properties, but they just point out that moral non-naturalists need not hold this, at least if we accept the moral fixed points view. And so that might be a way for the non-naturalist to respond to the metaphysical objections to their view. Second, there were the epistemic concerns. How could we know these non-natural moral truths? One way to put this puzzle is in terms of causal efficiency. If moral truths are non-natural, then presumably they can't have any causal powers. Anything that anything that can have a causal influence on us must be a natural thing. But if we have no causal contact with the moral truths, then our knowledge of these truths is a mystery. It would just be our moral beliefs would be cut off from the moral facts. But the moral fixed points are conceptual truths, and for knowledge of conceptual truths, causal contact with those truths is not required. What is required is simply adequate grasp of the concepts. So what gives us access to conceptual truths is not that there's some property or fact in the world that causally influences us in such a way as to cause us to form particular beliefs. No, all that's required is conceptual mastery, right? So Cuneo and Shafer-Landau take the example that actuality entails possibility. So if something actually exists, then it is possible that it exists. That's true. It's a conceptual truth. But the fact that actuality entails possibility, well, that has no causal powers. It's just an entailment relation between concepts, and we know it because we understand the concepts. So, similarly with claims like recreational slaughter is wrong, well, we know that by just having an understanding of the concepts of slaughter and wrongness. Third, consider arguments from moral disagreement. Anti-realists sometimes challenge realism by appealing to pervasive moral disagreement. There are various kinds of disagreement arguments. So one sort of argument here is that the best explanation of moral disagreement implies that there are no moral truths. It implies that our moral judgments are a product of cultural inculcation or our way of life rather than detection of objective values. Or it may be that disagreement defeats the warrant for moral beliefs. I have a video on moral disagreement that explores a variety of different disagreement arguments, so go and check that out. Again, I'll link that in the comments. Importantly, though, these arguments only work if the disagreement occurs between people who are competent judges. If somebody is insane or ignorant or conceptually confused, then it just doesn't matter if they disagree with our moral judgments. I mean, there's plenty of people who disagree that the Earth is billions of years old, but in itself that doesn't threaten a realist view of contemporary cosmology because most of those people are not competent judges. They're just ignorant of the relevant evidence. The concern in the case of moral disagreement is that it seems to persist even among intelligent people who have thought carefully about the topic. Now, consider the moral fixed points. Well, actually, there's very little disagreement about these. The moral fixed points have, at least according to Cuneo and Shafer-Landau, they have nearly universal consensus over all times and cultures. I mean, there are a few deviants who reject the moral fixed points. We can point to people like the Marquis de Sade or someone like that, but it's not at all obvious that we should take such people to be competent users of moral concepts. So Cuneo and Shafer-Landau think that the moral fixed points view provides a good explanation of the patterns of moral agreement and disagreement. There is widespread consensus on certain conceptual truths, and where disagreement does exist, this can be attributed to conceptual deficiency. So some people are just going to be influenced by, bias, prejudice, ignorance, irrationality, and that can lead them to be conceptually deficient, to be, that just, I guess, in some sense, like confused, conceptually confused with respect to moral concepts. But actually there is, among people who are clearly competent judges, there is very little disagreement about the moral fixed points. Fourth, Cuneo and Shafer-Landau argue that the moral fixed points furnish as a response to the evolutionary debunking argument. I'm not going to explain this argument in any detail here. Again, I have a video on it. I'm sorry, I keep sort of directing you to other videos I've done, but that's just because if I tried to explain all of this in detail, it would be, like 5 hours long or something. So, so the basic idea of the evolutionary debunking argument is that our evolutionary history explains why we have the moral attitudes that we do. The reason why we hold certain normative beliefs. So the reason why we believe that, for instance, survival and cooperation is good is because those beliefs promoted survival and reproduction among our ancestors. And then the claim is that if there were objective moral values, these values will have played no role in shaping our moral beliefs. So even if survival and cooperation were bad, we would still believe that survival and cooperation are good, because having a pro-attitude to survival and cooperation enhanced fitness among our ancestors. And so, like, and that, like, those sort of kind of, like, cognitive tendencies remain with us today. That's just like how we've evolved. Those cognitive tendencies remain with us, so we would still have a pro-attitude to survival and reproduction. Basically, to survival and cooperation, rather. Basically, we would have developed the same moral beliefs regardless of what the moral values actually are. And this is supposed to undermine our justification for our moral beliefs. Now, Cuneo and Shafer-Landau point out that an assumption of this kind of argument is that there are no conceptual constraints on what counts as a moral system. So this argument assumes that, as a matter of conceptual possibility, the objective values might have been anything at all. Like, it's conceptually possible that survival and cooperation are bad, that life is worthless, that we should behave with brutality and cruelty to those who help us, and so on. But if we accept the moral fixed points, we can say, no, there are conceptual constraints on what counts as a moral system. The moral fixed points themselves provide these conceptual constraints. It belongs to the essence of the concept wrong, that anything that satisfies recreational slaughter also satisfies wrong. So survival is going to turn out to be good as a matter of conceptual necessity. At least, like, it's going to be pro tanto good. Not good in all circumstances, but generally speaking, it's pro tanto good, right? Survival is pro tanto good. That's just a conceptual truth. Now, of course, some of our moral beliefs will be subject to the distorting influences of evolutionary history, but we're not completely in the dark about which beliefs are suspect, because we can rely on the moral fixed points to guide us. Okay, well, that is the moral fixed points view. So, hopefully that's, given you some sense of what exactly the view is and why we might believe it, and why it's perhaps a helpful view for moral non-naturalists. But let's turn now to some of the objections to the moral fixed points. So a first concern, and this is noted by Cuneo and Shafer-Landau themselves actually, is that if the moral fixed points are conceptual truths, then anybody who rejects the moral fixed points must be conceptually deficient. Now, this is perhaps a plausible line to take with people like the Marquis de Sade, who hold moral views that the majority of us find completely repugnant. It's plausible enough, when you read someone like the Marquis de Sade, who says that actually it's a good thing to murder and rape and torture people, brutality and bloodshed for all. You might react to that by saying, all right, this guy just he just doesn't know what these terms mean, right? Like he just doesn't know what the term wrong and term good and bad and so on. He's not a competent user of those terms. But now consider that there are also error theorists. Error theorists hold that all moral propositions are false. Now, error theorists usually have the same values and attitudes as the general population. They just think that moral propositions specifically, moral concepts specifically, are defective in some way. But an error theorist will, just like the average person, an error theorist will consider recreational slaughter to be horrifying. She will do her best to build a society where recreational slaughter is discouraged. She will try to teach her children to respect other people's lives. She will, she will express disgust and horror at recreational slaughter. She may even use the proposition recreational slaughter is wrong. She may sort of use that as a tool for expressing her attitudes. A lot of error theorists say that we should view moral propositions as being useful fictions. So morality is a useful fiction. But, ultimately the error theorist will judge that these propositions are false because she thinks that they are in some way defective. Maybe moral concepts involve a commitment to categorical normativity or something like that, and the error theorist thinks that there is no categorical normativity, right? So the error theorist judges these propositions to be false, but she still has the same kind of attitudes and behaviour as the average person. Now, it may well be that error theorists are mistaken. Maybe there are moral truths, but the question is, are error theorists conceptually deficient? Because if we think that error theorists are just as conceptually competent as the rest of us, then we should deny that the moral fixed points are conceptual truths. Because error theorists say that the moral fixed points are false, that all the moral fixed points are false. The error theorists reject all of the moral fixed points. They say that they're all false. And so if rejecting the moral fixed points exhibits conceptual deficiency, then error theorists must be conceptually deficient. But it's not obvious that error theorists are conceptually deficient. So Stephen Ingram presses this point in his reply to Cuneo and Shafer-Landau. So first of all, notice that error theorists may well be apparently very competent users of moral language and moral inference and moral discourse in general. So indeed, as professional philosophers, error theorists have probably thought in more detail about moral problems than the average layperson has. They probably thought more carefully about normative theories like utilitarianism, Kantian deontology and so on than the average person has. And when error theorists do engage in moral argument, when they do express their values and reason about their values, and when they use moral propositions to do so, they don't make the kind of obvious mistakes that we would normally associate with conceptual deficiency. Moreover, and this is particularly problematic, I think, error theorists actually appear to agree substantially with non-naturalists about the semantics of moral discourse. So error theorists actually agree with non-naturalists about what moral statements mean. So they agree that moral judgments purport to describe objective values. When I make a claim like recreational slaughter is wrong, the error theorist will agree that what this proposition does is it tries to attribute a property to an action. Like the property, it's attributing the property of wrongness to an action, and it is expressing a belief, right, about that action. So recreational slaughter is wrong, is a proposition that can be true or false. It's purporting to describe objective values in the world. Moreover, error theorists agree that moral concepts are not reducible to natural concepts. Error theorists agree that we cannot define moral concepts in terms of natural concepts. Like we can't define moral goodness in terms of pleasure, for instance. The only difference between moral non-naturalists and error theorists is that error theorists give greater weight to certain arguments against the existence of objective value. Look, they might be mistaken about how powerful those arguments are, but it would seem a bit strange to say that merely endorsing such arguments makes somebody conceptually deficient. As Stephen Ingram notes, it seems that error theorists are proceeding in accordance with standard philosophical methodology. So error theorists begin by looking at the practice of moral discourse. They find that non-naturalism provides the best account of the meaning of moral discourse, but then they judge that non-naturalism is unacceptable in the face of certain skeptical challenges, so they conclude that all moral judgments are mistaken. It doesn't, it doesn't seem like there's a conceptual deficiency here. One objection to the moral fixed points view is that we end up attributing conceptual deficiency just too broadly. A second objection concerns the notion of conceptual truth that Cuneo and Shafer-Landau are using. This is discussed by Dan and Bart Streumer in the article, Are the Moral Fixed Points Conceptual Truths? So Evers and Streumer ask us to consider the proposition, benevolence is rewarded by God. Now, arguably, this proposition bears all of the four hallmarks of conceptual truth that were identified by Cuneo and Shafer-Landau, at least as far as a Christian is going to be concerned. So if this proposition is true, it's necessarily true. Moreover, it seems that it has framework status. So any religion that fails to incorporate this proposition will just fail to count as a kind of Christianity, right? Like you're not. If you deny this proposition, you're just not talking about the God that Christians are talking about, right? Moreover, to deny it would just be kind of baffling, and it's knowable a priori, right? God is, by definition, perfectly good, omnipotent, omniscient. Part of the essence of concepts such as perfect goodness, omnipotence, and omniscience is that any entity with such traits would reward benevolence. So, it certainly looks like this is a kind of proposition that would count as a sort of theological fixed point of Christianity. Like any religion that fails to include this just isn't Christianity, and this maybe is one of those propositions that fixes the boundaries of Christianity. So a Christian may well say that, look, it just belongs to the essence of the concept rewarded by God, that anything that satisfies benevolence, anything that is an example of benevolence, is also going to satisfy rewarded by God. That's plausible enough, but this isn't a conceptual truth, because it's not a conceptual truth that God exists. Benevolence is rewarded by God entails that God exists. So if benevolence is rewarded by God is a conceptual truth, then it would be a conceptual truth that God exists. But clearly that's not a conceptual truth. Indeed, it may not be true at all. It may be false. If God does not exist, then it's false that benevolence is rewarded by God. So Evers and Streumer suggest that the conceptual truth here is not that benevolence is rewarded by God. Instead, the conceptual truth would be that if anything is rewarded by God, benevolence is rewarded by God. But that's just a conditional claim. It doesn't make any claim that God exists. Here's another example that comes from Paul Churchland in his book Scientific Realism and the Plasticity of Mind. Churchland obviously wasn't responding to the Moral Fixed Points article, but I think his example kind of works in the same way. So Churchland is considering examples of sentences where denial of those sentences would seem to evince a conceptual deficiency, like sentences like unmarried men are bachelors, sentences that appear to be true in virtue of their meaning or true in virtue of their constituent concepts. And so Churchland asks us to consider the following sentences, which would have been endorsed by some chemists in the 17th and 18th century, who proposed the phlogiston theory of combustion. So, premise 1, phlogiston is an elemental substance. Premise 2, phlogiston forms compounds with other substances. Premise 3, combustion consists in the release of phlogiston from a compound substance containing it. Now, these propositions are not simply empirical claims. In some sense, they are definitional. They define what phlogiston is. Sentences such as these are used to introduce the term into our language, right? Like they define it, that they tell us what phlogiston is supposed to be. So it seems like to deny any of these sentences would just be inconsistent with our understanding of the term phlogiston. So, you know, these phlogiston chemists could have said, you know, look, it's part of the essence of phlogiston that necessarily anything that satisfies elemental substance also satisfies phlogiston. And yet we have no doubt in denying all of these propositions because phlogiston doesn't exist. The only plausible candidate for a conceptual truth here is that if phlogiston exists, then phlogiston is an elemental substance. So it's not a conceptual truth that God exists or that phlogiston exists. And so these propositions are not conceptual truths either. The only conceptual truths here, the only plausible candidates for conceptual truths here are the conditional claims. The claim that if anything is rewarded by God, benevolence is rewarded by God. The claim that if phlogiston exists, then phlogiston is an elemental substance. But somebody who denies the existence of God, somebody who denies the existence of phlogiston, could accept both of these claims. So now let's turn again to the proposed moral fixed points. So take recreational slaughter of a fellow person is wrong. Well, Cuneo and Shafer-Landau say this is a conceptual truth. It belongs to the essence of wrong, that necessarily anything that satisfies recreational slaughter also satisfies wrong. The concern about Cuneo and Shafer-Landau's claim is that, well, it's not a conceptual truth that anything is wrong. It's not a conceptual truth that anything actually satisfies the concept wrong. It's not a conceptual truth that wrongness exists. If wrongness does not exist, then it's false. Then, you know, this proposition that recreational slaughter of a fellow person is wrong is false. It's going to be false that anything that satisfies recreational slaughter also satisfies wrong. What is plausibly an example of a conceptual truth is instead the conditional claim that if anything is wrong, recreational slaughter of a fellow person is wrong. But of course an error theorist can accept that claim. An error theorist can accept that if anything is wrong, recreational slaughter is wrong. They just deny that anything is wrong. So the moral fixed points may well bear the marks associated with conceptual truths, but this only shows that if anything satisfies the moral concepts, then the moral fixed points are true. I mean, even anti-realists can accept this. The anti-realists deny that anything satisfies moral concepts. I mean, there's maybe a more general point to these examples. What we find in the case of, you know, phlogiston, for instance, I think it's particularly clear in the phlogiston case anyway, is that concepts themselves are subject to criticism and modification. So conceptual change plays an important role in our learning about the world, and there may be cases where our very concepts embody false assumptions. So that seems to be the case with, you know, like when we talk about phlogiston, when we talk about combustion in terms of release of phlogiston, arguably the concepts that we're using embody certain false assumptions about the world. And this is just what the error theorist will say about moral concepts. The error theorist will say that moral concepts involve a commitment to, you know, categorical normativity, but that there is no categorical normativity, that categorical normativity is incoherent or something along those lines. So, yeah, that's a second objection there, a second concern. Okay, let's turn to a third and final objection. So, let's say we grant that the moral fixed points are in fact conceptual truths. What does this tell us? Well, it tells us something about a moral system. It tells us about the relations between moral concepts. But now consider this. Couldn't I define, for instance, an amoral system, which is the mirror of the moral system, and which has exactly the opposite propositions as its fixed points? So the amoral system is constructed from fixed points such as it is a right to recreationally slaughter fellow persons. It is a right to humiliate others simply for pleasure. These are conceptual truths of the amoral system. So it belongs to the essence of a right that necessarily anything that satisfies recreational slaughter also satisfies a right. That's just how amoral concepts are defined, right? We can just stipulate this. And I can also define various schmoral systems. Schmoral systems are normative systems that include some, but not all, of the moral fixed points. So what we have then are various systems, various normative systems. There are moral systems based on the moral fixed points, but there's also the amoral systems that deny all of the moral fixed points, or at least they kind of have the mirror of the moral fixed points. And then there's various schmoral systems that include only some of the moral fixed points. Then the question is, why should we think that it's the moral system that objectively matters? Why should we conduct our lives in accordance with the moral system? So the concern here is that taking moral fixed points to be conceptual truths is going to drain them of any significance, because we can always come up with different conceptual systems that will include different conceptual truths. There are plenty of conceptual amoral truths and conceptual schmoral truths. And as a purely conceptual matter, it doesn't look like we're making any mistake in choosing one of these systems over the others. Like, if I decide to select, the amoral system or a schmoral system as being, the system that is going to guide my behaviour, it doesn't look like I'm making a conceptual error there. Now, traditionally, non-naturalists would presumably say that what favours the moral system is that there are in fact moral facts and properties. So moral concepts pick out real things in the world. They pick out like objective values or something. Whereas, there are no amoral facts, no amoral properties, right? Amoral concepts do not pick out anything in the world. So, we might try to kind of back it up with that sort of like metaphysical approach. But then, of course, we seem to be abandoning what is distinctive about the moral fixed points view. We're just kind of back to like traditional non-naturalism there. So David Cullerin, in his article Why Care About the Moral Fixed Points, develops this concern. He argues that Cuneo and Shafer-Landau's view rules out the possibility that we should care about morality. It makes morality irrelevant to us. So to see what the trouble is, suppose that Verity is trying to decide whether to engage in recreational slaughter. She really enjoys killing people. She has the power to kill people without repercussions, but then she wonders, should I do it? And we say no, because recreational slaughter is wrong. Now, if Verity asks why she should believe that recreational slaughter is wrong, then we can sort of appeal to this moral fixed points view. We can say it's a conceptual truth. We can say, it belongs to the essence of wrong, that anything that satisfies recreational slaughter also satisfies wrong. Like, recreational slaughter falls under the concept wrong. But notice all that we've expressed here is a claim about the relations between concepts. And Cullerin says that mere relations between concepts don't provide reasons for action. Reasons for action are given not by concepts, they are given by properties, facts, causal connections, individuals, and so on. Mere concepts aren't going to provide reasons for action. So by comparison, suppose that Tim is a bachelor. Now, we might say that this gives us reasons to act in particular ways. If we are estate agents, then the fact that Tim is a bachelor gives us reason to offer him a studio apartment rather than a house. But notice that the reason here is not given by the fact that Tim falls under a certain concept, right? It just, like, the fact that the concept bachelor correctly applies to Tim, the fact that, like, Tim is one of the things picked out by that concept is irrelevant, right? Like, you know, so the reason why we should offer him a studio apartment rather than a house has to do with the facts that make it the case that the concept bachelor applies to Tim. So it's just facts about, like, you know, Tim's lifestyle, his behaviours, and so on. So similarly, we may well have reasons to avoid performing actions such as recreational slaughter, but the mere fact that those actions fall under a certain concept is not going to be among those reasons. The mere fact that recreational slaughter falls under the concept wrong is not going to be a reason for us to refrain from doing it. Killerin says that the moral fixed points turn out to be just normatively irrelevant. We shouldn't care about them. So it just drains morality of its normative significance. Well, that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I should note, incidentally, if you've come this far and you know, you want to talk about these issues, I do have a Discord, which I've had for quite a while, but I haven't really mentioned it in many videos before. But that Discord link will also be in this video description, as is my Patreon, should you wish to give me money. So yes, that's all for today. Thank you for watching.